It's my absolute pleasure to welcome today Doug Lemov. Doug's joining us from just outside of New York and has agreed to come and share some thoughts, answer some questions, and just share a little bit of his journey. As you know, Doug was a teacher, is a teacher. He was a school principal. He's an author of Teach Like a Champion, a book that many of us have used in various situations. He was the director of the Uncommon Schools. And so in many ways, Doug has walked so many of the paths to impact that we talk about at JGF. So it's an incredible honor and privilege to have Doug join us. Doug, thanks so much for making time for us and coming to share with us at our 2022 ConnectED Summit.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Honestly, the honor is mine. It's a treat to get to talk to so many teachers about the most important work in the world. And if I get to play a tiny role in what you guys do, then I'm really happy. So thanks for inviting me.
Doug, let's start, if you don't mind, with your journey into becoming a teacher. You, I think, were an English and history teacher at New Jersey School. How did you transition from college, from studying at university into becoming a teacher? What was the motivation there? How did you make that move?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't really, who knows how intentional it was. I remember I was an English major, and I remember how much I'd loved, many of the teachers that I'd had growing up and how important they'd been, both academically, and I just felt a strong connection to a lot of them. And I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do with my life and career. So I thought, well, I'll start with teaching. If nothing else, it will be, a debt of gratitude I can pay for all the teachers who I've loved and have influenced me. So I took a job right out of college at an independent school. I got to coach football and teach English and do all kinds of different things. And so I kind of wandered into it in some ways and wasn't sure whether I'd love it. Did love it, right away, as I'm sure many of your fellows experienced. But I wasn't sure where I was going when I started, for sure.
Yeah. Doug, I think for many of our teachers, the kind of move into their first classroom is one that is both exciting but challenging. This part of your career, you are now steeped in the wisdom of teaching techniques. Can you even remember back in your first year or two? How did you make sense of it all? Did you just dive in and give it your best, or how did you approach things?
Yeah, for the most, I think it was, I would really not like to see it. Thankfully, there's no video of me as a first year teacher. And if there were, I would really not like to see it. I think I had the best of intentions and cared a lot about books and reading in English and cared a lot about my students, but really had no idea how to go about the craft of teaching. And, had never thought about cognitive science and how that would affect how people learn and what people read. And so I think I was just kind of doing my best to figure it out as I went. And I think I got a lot wrong, which I think, there were several times in my career where I essentially tried to leave teaching. And if I look back on it, I think that teaching is a really hard job psychologically and emotionally. One of the things I remember most is coming home so tired after the first, in my first couple of years of teaching. You teach 4 or 5 classes in the course of the day. And not only was it just physically tiring, getting up on stage for an hour and then going to sit down at your desk to grade papers is a real shift between this performative work and very intellectual work. But it's emotional and psychologically intense to get up on stage and to, sometimes I would be really happy because I'd felt successful. And sometimes I would feel like I'd done a really poor job, and that's a hard thing to live with. And so at the end of the day, I'd have 5 of these lessons that I taught, and my mental state, I couldn't always even trace back to the antecedent events that had caused me to be elated or depressed, or whatever it was, because there was just so much information and so much intensity coming at you quickly that I think it's a really challenging part of the job. But I do think that that's why I think helping teachers be successful is so important, right? You work hard, you deserve to be successful, and to know at the end of the day that you made a difference for your students.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the way you describe it is the reality that many of our Rockstar first year students experience, that kind of emotional exhaustion, a physical exhaustion, and then a desperate intention to want to be great in the classroom for your students.
I think that's right. You should dream of being great, right? That's inspiring people, but that's also a hard threshold to set for yourself.
Yeah. One of the questions one of our students asked, I'm just going to drop it in now because it links in, is one of our first year teachers, Murray Hines, who also actually teaches English, history, and drama. His question was that he sometimes struggles becoming too emotionally invested in the students. We talk about this emotional engagement that we have. And his question is, do you have any advice about creating these healthy emotional boundaries with your work, particularly within the classroom?
Yeah, it's really, really challenging, right? Because you care deeply about your students and what happens to them. And yet the ideal role that we play for them has to be a little bit arm's length. I talk about this with my children as a father, sometimes with my children, which is I care about them deeply and incredibly emotionally invested. And sometimes I have to step back and tell them to do things that make them not love me in the moment, not love me as much in the moment, right? They don't want to be told that they have to take out the trash, but it's the best thing for them to learn to do their chores. And so you have to take out the trash, and, there's some eye rolling. I think that's part of teaching too. I guess two thoughts. One, it's important to take the long view and to understand that people who come to appreciate your caring for them in the long run understand high expectations and respect, and they know that the people who care about them most, they know that you're not supposed to be their friend, though they should know that you care about them, and they know that the people who care about them most aren't always the people who make them happy in the moment. And I think that, you can put yourself to this test, which is if you think back about the teachers who you value most. The teacher who I think about now, I value most, I didn't like at all, really, or I wouldn't say I didn't like him at all, because I respected him immensely, and he was a really challenging teacher. But if you had asked me, who were my favorite teachers when I was a high school student, he would not have been in the top 5 list. And it was only, like years later when I went to university that I realized that he was really the person who taught me to read. And so I think that we have to trust at some level that students understand that. Yeah. And then the other thing is, I think that I've been writing quite a bit about, relationships. And I think it's important to recognize how profoundly important social norms and peer norms are in the classroom. And that oftentimes when a teacher says, oh, I love Mr. Gibbon, he's a great teacher, he's a great teacher, they mean a combination of how you interact with me as a teacher and how I feel when I'm in your classroom. Mm-hmm. And if the classroom environment is engineered in a way so that my peers show me respect and appreciation, and when I talk, they're looking at me and they're nodding and they seem to value my ideas, then I feel connection and bond with you through the environment that you've created. And I think there are really 2 important ways that teachers reach students. One is sort of direct interactions. Yes, thank you. What a lovely answer. I really appreciate your effort on that. And the other one is, can I engineer an environment so that your peers send that message to you as well? And then I feel fulfilled and happy and excited about learning in your classroom.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Murray, you got that? What a fabulous answer to.
Also forgive yourself, just because there will be I just feel this very, both as a teacher and a parent, there'll be times when you're like, I was far from perfect. I just think, everyone feels that.
Yeah. Fabulous. Now, Doug, very quickly in your professional career, you I think were a co-founder of the Academy of the Pacific Rim Charter School, and then I think became the school principal at the age of 28.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Tell us about that. How did that come about? I mean, that is a bit crazy.
Yeah. Sometimes I can't. It's quite something to think back on. So I was a teacher for 3 years at this independent school that I started at. And then I thought, maybe I want to teach at the highest level. Maybe I want to be an English professor at a university like the teachers that I love there. And so I started to get a PhD in English. And very quickly I realized that the world of academia is not about teaching at all, and you're not really evaluated on your teaching. No one particularly cares. And I didn't think that I could spend my life working away in the bowels of a machine that didn't value what I valued. And so I kind of reached out to some people who I knew and just started networking to find like, what else is out there in the world of education? And I called this woman who I knew from my university days, and she said, oh, I'm starting a school. And that concept was stunning to me. I mean, it's sort of common now for people to start schools, but back then I was like, how could you start a school? But we ended up chatting about it, and we believed in a lot of, I think, similar things. And so I decided, well, I'm going to move to Boston and start this school with her. And I was really interested for some reason in school culture and discipline, and the idea that that to care about people and to love people, you have to set expectations, and that people respect you in the end when you do. And so I took the job. I was an English teacher and history teacher, but I took the job of being the dean of students, which is like when you behave in a way that's contrary to the culture of the school and the values of the school, you got sent to me. Yeah. And I probably did like everything, I got a lot wrong and maybe a few things right. And after a year or two, this is in the late 90s, she called me into her office one day. It was right before Christmas vacation. And she said, guess what? And I said, what? She said, I'm moving to Silicon Valley. She had built this sort of information management system. This is the late 90s when, .com startup was just getting hot. And she said, and I've gotten financing to take this thing global, and I'm going, and you're in charge. And I literally looked over my shoulder to see if someone was behind me. But I got, because I was the person who you got sent to, I was the face of authority. And I felt totally unprepared for this job. Mm. But I think and then she left. And I think the one thing that I got right was that I realized very quickly that, who you could ask, like, who's the question of who is the person who can do all the things correct that are required to be done to run a great school? And I think the answer is there isn't one person who can do that. And I think I was very keenly aware, thankfully, that was not me, that I didn't have all the answers. And so I just kind of assembled around myself a team full of, 4 or 5 people who I respected the most on the staff. And we kind of led by group. We would meet 2 or 3 times a week and just sort of go through all the challenges and problems in the school and decide them together. And I think that had 2 effects. One, I think it made better decisions, but 2, I think it vested them in the process. It felt to them like it was their school as much as my school, and that they were leaders as much as I was. And I think that got communicated to the staff generally, so that, when we would sit around at a staff meeting and say, how should we handle this? There really wasn't like a they who would they say we have to do that. We really felt like we were deciding, and we had ownership stake in the decisions that we made. And so people were very vested in them. And when we decided, people wouldn't always agree in the process, but once we made a decision, everyone was all in. And so maybe that was the, sort of accidentally and through the necessary humility of realizing that I wasn't quite prepared for that job, kind of stumbled into a model of shared leadership that I think ended up being fairly successful.
Yeah, wonderful. Doug, there's a theme, I think, that I pick up as I read your work and read up more about you of this drawing. You're being drawn into the space of schools that support students from low-income communities. And in particular, Teach Like a Champion is kind of geared towards this idea of getting students to college. So talk to us a little bit, and the charter school movement is a free school movement in the UK. Why? What drew you into the space? And for us in South Africa, there's a very particular context with deep inequality within our society, and that inequality is mirrored perfectly in our schooling system, and we have some extraordinarily wealthy, well-resourced school, and the majority of under-resourced schools. And so for us, it's a real issue that we deal with on a regular basis. The students and teachers that are listening to this are making choices about where they spend their time, how they invest their energy. You clearly, from an early age, decided that was going to be the space. Why? How did that come about?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I guess I couldn't imagine doing anything else is just such a clear necessity, both for the people and the families that you serve. The students themselves made such a profound influence on me. The first question from the teacher they asked was about how much you care about your students, to like work with those students and realize how much is on the line for them is a very profound experience, profound in a lot of positive ways too, which is like, you recognize that your decisions really matter and you have the capacity to help make things go right in someone's life that society is not attentive enough to. And so that was very, just personally, it mattered a lot to me, especially meeting the parents. I was a parent of a young child at the time. And I just remember thinking, like, what must it be like to send your child to a school that you're not sure that the school will assist you in accomplishing, what you aspire to for your child. So that was very powerful. But I also just think from a social perspective, I just don't know that democracies can sustain unless meritocracy is real and unless people feel like they have the opportunity in that society to become the things that they dream of and aspire to. So it's both personal and social. And like we have deep and profound inequality in our schools. It's not a competition, so I won't compare it to South Africa, but they're both deep. Who knows which one is worse. My first job wasn't in a high needs. My first job was in a school for fairly prosperous families, and I always felt like from the beginning that it was fine, but it wasn't really the place that I wanted to be working. And as soon as I worked with families and communities of need, in some ways, I think I just fell in love with those families and how much, I love talking to the parents and meeting with the parents and talking to them about their children and their aspirations for them. So probably a lot of the story that a lot of your teachers feel, which is it's just kind of a moral imperative.
Mm-hmm. Doug, I believe you went on to start the Uncommon School Group. I think you directed
help start. Yeah,
help start. There we go. You talk about gathering a great group of people around, and I think in your book you link clearly. You make the link between success in classroom and then hiring, developing, and retaining the best teachers. And those three things, as I read that sentence, I thought, wow, I spent some time as a school principal, and that was my life. How do I get the best people to come? How do I develop them, and how do I hold on to them? What did you feel like you got right, or that the Uncommon Schools have got right in that particular area?
Well, I think first, real clarity on the first obligation of an organization is to make its people better, right? Like, it's not just the parents and children, the parents who bring their children and ask, it's teachers who bring you their careers and who deserve to be successful. And if those people are willing to work hard at a job that is difficult, where they aren't paid as much as they can be paid in other sectors, and there are easier places where they can work, where there aren't as successful, that is the first obligation of the organization, is to make sure that they do right the teachers they've hired. I think it's really where Teach Like a Champion started, which is, people would come to me my teachers would come to me when I was this sort of young and mildly unprepared teacher of the school. And they would ask me these questions about, what do you do if, what do you do if, what do you do if? And I just felt like I couldn't answer the questions. And that just felt profoundly wrong to me. And so I think, Uncommon and the schools the best schools that I've worked with have always had this mentality of like, owe it to people to help them become great. And that's a really hard thing to engineer. Schools are first and foremost cultures. I think that's one of the most important things to realize about the classroom for students. Like the classroom communicates to young people what their relationship is to the endeavor of school and the endeavor of learning. That's the first and foremost thing it does, but it's also the same for adults. And what a school communicates to them about their own development. It's obvious to us, I think, that having a growth mindset where your goal is to get a little bit better every day is clearly valuable for students. It's not always clear or expressed by a lot of organizations that should be the goal for teachers, that a little bit better every day, that the desire, the growth mindset applies to adults too. And I think that the best organizations are kind of obsessed with that. There's a fascinating working paper by this organization called TNTP in the US. It's called the Mirage Report. And they basically studied teacher professional development across 10 large school districts and 1 or 2 sort of charter management organizations. And what they found was that the average district spent about 1/3 to 1/2 of a teacher's salary every year on professional development. And on net, almost nobody got better. 1 out of 10 teachers got better every year. I just think we're supposed to know a lot about learning and how to get people better. It's a profound failure. It's as big a failure as like the kids aren't learning math and the teachers aren't learning anything about how to solve problems in the classroom. But there were 1 or 2 organizations, especially one charter management organization that they studied, where 8 out of 10 teachers improved dramatically every year. And what they realized about this organization was that it wasn't so much about the content of what they talked about with the teachers, but it was about the culture. That after a staff meeting where they talked about, here's what we want to try and do in the classroom, the teachers went out of the room and they started talking to each other and emailing each other about like, okay, here's our term for this. How are we going to do this? How are you doing it? What's working for you? And in the other schools, the teachers would sort of have their arms crossed for trying to get through the meeting. And after the meeting, the content of the meeting was over. And that's the death of professional development. So I think so much of it is about building a culture that communicates to teachers that this organization is about you and your growth and your development. And that's both, we want to invest in you, we want to honor, we want to make you great, because that's what people want. And it's also a responsibility and obligation of, if you fit our culture, you love that and you want it. And if you're the kind of person who isn't very passionate about getting great, there's a better school for you and it's not ours.
Yeah, sure. It's such a wonderful dual perspective, how important culture is both in classroom and in school, and holding those 2 things together. I think you probably, your words are resonating strongly, I think, with those people that are listening within our community. The immediate.
Can I say one tiny thing just about the linkage between like student culture and adult culture, which is, we were at a workshop once and a teacher raised their hand and they said, can you have great student culture without great adult culture? I thought it was a fascinating question. And one of my colleagues said, yes, but not for long, which is like, unless the teachers are committed and all in and feel valued and invested in, they won't be able to build a kind of culture that helps students do the hard work that is necessary of them to succeed and thrive, especially when that journey is going to be difficult and long and challenging.
Having been in so many schools and seen them working, observed them, is it too simplistic to say that the development of that culture is simply a leadership competency, that it sits with the leader or the leadership group, or is there more to it than that?
I think it starts with the leaders, and that the leaders have to communicate, have to set the tone. And there are times when leaders have to make clear decisions and set values and live by those values. But part of leadership is also, I think, the strategic divestment and of decision making. I think one of the key things that we've learned in the charter school sector is that accountability and autonomy have to live at the same place in an organization, right? That if I let you make decisions, I have to then, you deserve to be accountable for those decisions and be able to make further decisions based on whether they work. And if I hold you accountable, I have to let you make decisions that influence the outcome. And so I think that involves a fair amount of strategic delegation. I think to just go back to that moment at my first school where we were sitting around, I didn't realize how important this was at the time, but we're sitting around the table and everyone felt like we, but there's no they that tells us how to do it. It's a we that make our decisions. I think that is, leadership has to set the direction and make clear values and even make, our philosophy clear, right? We're a writing intensive school. That's not something that may not be something that's negotiable, right? That I'm willing to, we're a writing intensive school and I have a teacher who says, well, I don't really believe in that writing stuff and I'm just not going to do that. That doesn't work. And I think that's a major problem in schools, which is unless I can hire carefully for alignment to values. It's really hard to have fidelity to ideas as an organization. But once I set those priorities, then I think like, how do we become writing intensive? How do we become great at writing intensive? I have to push those decisions down into the organization, both because they will be better decisions, but also people will become more vested in them. And so I think there's a sort of dance of delegation and clarity that makes culture start with leaders, but in the end, it's a shared endeavor between leaders and teachers, and in many cases, parents as well can play a role.
Yeah. So, Doug, there was clearly a time when you shifted your focus from working intensely within the school to taking a step back and starting to observe teachers and develop the taxonomy that then became TLAC. Tell us a little about what was the catalyst? What kind of shifted you and your thinking?
What caused me to start writing the book? I didn't really realize I was writing the book when I started writing it, honestly. I just was kind of taking notes. I remember this, I was the principal of the school for several years, and then I went to business school, and then I started working with a group where, we would sort of like, I would visit schools and help them think about how to get better. And I remember visiting this school, and it was just full of really well-intentioned people who really cared about students. And they were trying to do so many things right. And the school was a disaster, honestly. It was such a hard thing to watch because it was really good people, really good, caring people failing. Oh, well, I hesitate to use that word, but maybe it's fair. I think, and the principal said, I know we're not doing what we need to be doing by kids. So I went to New York City and I visited 3 of the KIPP schools, which are sort of the best early charter schools in New York City. And he said, because I wanted to understand what they did. And I went, and he said, and here are the things that I noticed. And I would say that if I made a list of the top 20 things that made KIPP schools great, the things that he noticed were number 16, number 18, and one of the things that wouldn't have even been on the list. And so I was like, I just remember driving home from that school with a colleague, and we just started to make a list of like, well, what are the things that matter? And let's talk about in the classroom in particular. And it was really hard because there wasn't a shared vocabulary. We would, this long drive back from the school, we would be talking like circularly around like what it was that the teachers were or were not doing, and there wasn't a word for it. And so very quickly, my colleague and I just started like trying to come up with words to describe the things that we were describing. Unless we have a shared vocabulary to talk about technical decisions, we can't really. I just was reading, it's not so much what I know, it's what we know, right? And unless I have a technical vocabulary to be able to describe to you the things that I think I know, I can't share with you what I know, and we can't talk about it. And so it was coming back from that school that I think I realized that to help people perceive and talk about the things that were important, we needed a shared vocabulary. And I think that is maybe the most important thing about the Teach Like a Champion books. I know that there are a lot of people who don't agree with, a lot of the things in the book. And I would say that the one concept that I think everyone can use is shared vocabulary, right? If you see schools differently, develop your own vocabulary, but shared problem solving and shared decision making, which is, I think, what you were talking about from a leadership perspective, requires clear, precise, shared vocabulary to describe the important decisions that we make day to day. And I think for the most part, teaching has lacked that, and it's a big lack. It's a big gap not to have technical vocabulary.
Absolutely. I can testify to that. It was one of the things at the school that I was leading that we loved the most was we could have a discussion and say, well, why don't you try cold calling? And everybody knew what we were talking about. One of the other fun things was taking, language that for an American audience was normal and kind of trying to reinterpret it for a South African context. I think you had one called batter up or batters.
Bats. Yeah, that's right.
Bats. There we go. And at first we're like, what? We don't even know what that means.
Right. It's really interesting. I think it's so true, right? That I think I'm not really sure why, but I'm obsessed with naming things. I think naming things is really important. I spend a lot of time thinking about the names. And then, like, ironically, in the 3.0 version of Teach Like a Champion, I changed a lot of the names of techniques for a variety of reasons. One of my very favorite techniques, one of the most important techniques, I think, in the book, used to be called Control the Game. And it's about building cultures where students read aloud with each other, especially, and it develops their fluency and develops their love for reading. And I think to everyone, it was totally unclear where that phrase came from. The backstory on it is like I played your version of football, not our version of football, growing up. And I always imagined when I watched teachers do this technique that it was like a midfielder controlling a game of football, like receiving the ball, giving it off, receiving the ball, and that you influenced the behavior of people around you by giving them small opportunities to shine. But this was like never clear it was never even that clear to, sort of arrived at a name that was a poor name. And it took me a long time to recognize that I really had to change that name. So now it's called phase reading, and phase is short for fluent, accountable, shared, and expressive reading. It's a better name, but it's hard because a lot of people still use this term control the game. And I love the fact that people are committed to the old name, but constantly examining names and re-examining names and making names that are legible to people across different cultures and different communities. First of all, what a lucky honor for me to have people in South Africa reading my book and saying, what does at-bats mean? I should be, I'm lucky to have to ask that question, but I do think it's important to constantly think about names and defend names. Like one of the things we talk about on our staff a lot is that, as we study a technique, sometimes it's, what's in the technique will broaden. Cold call is a good example. If I tell a student that I'm going to cold call them before I cold call them, is that still a cold call?
Yeah.
And so it's great when you broaden a technique, but then you risk the technique becoming vague and people not being laser clear on what you mean by it. And so we might pre-call is what we call that. And it's important to have a slightly different name for it and constantly be defending your name so that they're clear and they're discreet, and the meaning, I can think of a term like scaffolding is a term that teachers use all the time in this country that I think is almost meaningless, can mean 6 different things to 6 different people. And I think as a purveyor of vocabulary, I think something I think about a lot, which is how do we make sure that the meaning is always clear and isn't diluted by well-intentioned broadening and or misuse.
Yeah.
I'm obsessed. So I guess the short version of that is I'm obsessed with vocabulary. Maybe that's my one skill.
I think there are a few others on your CV. A related question comes from one of our first year teachers, history teacher, Wandile Nzuza. And it's linked. It's not the same issue, but it's linked. So I just wanted to bring it in here. His question was around whether you've ever felt as your work has gone out of the original context in which it was developed, it's gone international. His question is based in South Africa. Have you ever felt a need, or do you think there is a need to completely rethink the philosophy and the different teaching techniques in different contexts and spheres? So in South Africa, we would have a private school context. We would have, a well-resourced public school, maybe rural schools, township schools, all very different contexts. How do you see that in terms of needing to rethink, or do you think that those techniques move easily?
Always rethink. I think that every context is different. So I imagine this book as a toolkit, and that these are tools, but that crafts people always use tools differently in every setting. Yeah. And so it's one of the first questions you should ask, which, first of all, I think every teacher is and should be different. And, there are cultural differences. I remember one of the first trips abroad I made to talk about teaching in an international context was to Jordan. And this is at a time when Jordan they had an immense number of refugees coming from other Middle Eastern countries. And the first thing that I said in the workshop was that I know that I'm going to show you video of American schools. And there are a lot of things that are distinctive about American schools and a lot of things that are flawed about our culture. And I know that some of the things that I show you in these videos won't apply to an Islamic context, to a Jordanian context, and to a refugee context, and to a context where there's 60 students in the room instead of 30. And so I just encourage you to always adapt and apply. And interestingly, the teacher, like the first teacher who spoke, said, no. Like, honestly, the videos, yes, there are things we have to adapt to, but we can still see that kids are kids and group dynamics are group dynamics. And there's still things that there's plenty for us to apply. And so I think both of those things are true, but I think it's not just true about cultures, it's true about individuals. And so whenever I always chafed as a teacher at systems where someone said, okay, here's the system, you have to throw out everything you do, and here's how it works in your class. I think the teachers should all be different, should all be unique. You're doing many things well. And what I tried to provide in this book is a set of tools that you can use and adapt and choose to help you become the teacher that you want to be in the context of what your students need. And so only a fool holds a hammer and thinks that everything is a nail. But I do think that this is a common challenge, which is people think of it as a formula. And I always describe it as a toolkit. It's a toolkit. And that means that you're a craftsperson and you have to make the decisions about what to use, when, and how. And it's definitely one of the challenges of the book. There are lots of schools I've been in where the administration will tell the teachers to use it in a specific way. And I probably wouldn't always be happy with that level of directiveness. And I always try to show when I do a training, if we're talking about cold call, 3 or 4 or 5 examples of different teachers cold calling in different styles in different settings so that teachers think right away about adapting techniques as opposed to copying techniques. Well, sometimes copying is a tool to adapting, which is first you copy it and then you adapt it over time. But I definitely agree that it always needs to be adapted to both broader cultural context and individual teacher style, approach, subject, context.
I suppose that leads on interestingly into a question about the book or the resource that you published on teaching in the online classroom. Mm-hmm. And there again, there's a technique and you're applying it into a new context. Just tell us a little bit what, I presume it was a quick response. You couldn't go and observe another 10,000 online classrooms. How did you kind of think about, did you take techniques and simply apply?
It was so fascinating. I remember I've been visiting a school in Denver, this is on March 13th, 2020 or whatever it was, flying home and getting a message that the next workshop that I was going to do was canceled and the next visit was canceled. And we had, maybe 10 or 12 large workshops scheduled for that spring where we're going to work with groups of hundreds of teachers in hotel rooms. And that, honestly, that was how we paid the salaries of our staff, which is from the revenues from those workshops. And so I got home and I was like, wow, if this thing goes on more than a couple weeks, we're going to have to start letting people go. And I love my people, and I don't want to, and so within 3 or 4 days, it was clear that it was going to be more than a few weeks. And so we all got together and thought about, well, do we have the capacity to study what teachers are doing and learn at this moment when people desperately need advice? And so we reached out to 100 schools that we knew and said, do you have any video of what you're doing? And fortunately, people had a ton of video because it was all on Zoom and they were taping it. And so within 3 or 4 days, people were sending us I remember the first videos that we watched of the first classrooms, but I still wasn't sure that we could learn anything from it and tell people anything useful. But I guess this goes back to, the notion of shared leadership, which is there were 12 of us sitting around, it wasn't a table anymore. We were sitting around Zoom, but as soon as we started to watch the video, we started to notice the things that teachers were doing, and it was remarkable. And there were small things that teachers did differently, even in those very first days, that we could identify and put names on and start sharing. And so, we were fortunate in that we were able to gather a lot of video, but I think we learned very quickly because that's what we do. We spend a lot of time studying teaching, and a lot of what we learned about how to watch and study teaching from years of doing Teach Like a Champion work definitely applied to online work. And then, very quickly, we started to do little blog posts and little tiny webinars on what we were learning. And I looked at our blog stats one day, and the data had doubled or tripled on the number of people who were reading our blog posts and watching our little clips. And I just realized there's an immense need. No one had, people have been thrown into this incredibly difficult situation with no guidance at all. And so that's kind of where I think within a few months, we realized that we have enough here to be useful to people. It won't be perfect. We're going to have to steel ourselves to write a book that quick is as important as perfect. Got to get it into people's hands for the next school year. And so I love that book. And I think even within, a week or two of writing it, there were things we wanted to change about it. And I was constantly emailing my publishers and saying, can we switch this? Can we add this video? It was a learning process. So it's an imperfect book, but it had to be a fast book because the need was just so overwhelming for people. I just remember that September 2020, doing a workshop for teachers in New York City. And, it was sort of 50 teachers and they were online with us. And more than half the people on that call had never seen video of other people teaching online. Imagine having no context, no comparables for you, no idea of what else they could be doing. What a massive disservice by the profession to not be able to show people examples of what it was that we wanted them to do under duress.
Yeah, sure. Amazing how quickly you were able to kind of pick up this change and then, start to analyze and think. I love that.
It was really a testament to the incredible people on my team. They just were so insightful.
Yeah.
Doug, and can I say, part of it was their brilliance as people, and part of it was just this environment that we have where we're constantly talking with shared vocabulary about what's happening in the classroom. And so I think a lot of it is one of my takeaways from the transferability of studying bricks and mortar classrooms to studying online classrooms is how powerful perception is. I've also written, I don't know if you know this, I wrote a book about sports coaching. And for a long time, I tried to keep this book secret from the people in my office because I felt really guilty about the fact that, the state of public schools in this country is unforgivable. And here I am spending 20 days a year working with, rugby clubs and football clubs. But very quickly, I realized that the things that I was learning in those settings are actually really, really applicable to the classroom. And the first chapter of that book is about perception and how important perception is to decision making. And one of the things that builds your perception is constantly looking and knowing what the cues are that you should be looking for in a complex environment. And I think that's what you get when you study video. And so one of my takeaways is just how profoundly important video is as a professional development tool for teachers in schools. And that one of the most valuable things you could be doing is getting together to watch segments of moments of each other's teaching and talking about it, because it developed your eyes. And when you develop your eyes, you develop your decision-making capacity. And I think that hugely ended up influencing how I rewrote Teach Like a Champion 3.0. A lot of it is around what's my mental model? What should I be looking for? What should I be looking at? How should I be thinking about making decisions? And a lot of that just started with recognizing the importance of perception.
Yeah. I think in the forward, Norman Atkins quotes you as having visited over 10,000 classrooms and watched 10,000 video clips. And I cannot even imagine spending that amount of time.
Well, I don't count, but I'm glad that Norm does.
And I think it's quite foreign, actually, for us to think about videoing ourselves and observing it. So that's a challenge we need to take on board. As an organization, we're working with a group who've developed a program called Teacher Choices in Action, and they use video clips of other teachers to observe the metacognitive process of making a decision in a complex environment like a classroom, and unpacking that, why the decision was made, what the repercussion is. And we're then going to develop a second version of that that then makes it much more personal, my choices in the context that I'm teaching in. And I'm feeling a challenge there for us to start videoing ourselves and watching it with that kind of lens.
I'm so glad you're doing that, because I think it's such a profoundly underutilized professional development tool. Video study, it's in the sport sector, yeah, everything gets videotaped and then studied, right, from individual performance to group performance, both practice and the game. And I think you're right. It's scary to see yourself videotaped, but it's very, very powerful. And then to talk about it and analyze it. One of the things that we decided early on with our videos is that in our workshops and in our books, we're never going to show video of teachers struggling and failing, because we just when our cameras show up in a teacher's classroom, I want them to know that it's because we love them and our goal is to honor them. But would there be immense value in looking at the moments when they struggled and where the cold call went slightly wrong? Yes. Do we do that when we work with schools individually? Yes. Is it really valuable to look at side by side? Here's a cold call that went great, and here's a cold call that didn't feel quite as effective. What's the difference? Why did A happen and why did B happen? I think that's as useful a professional development experience as there is. And so I just think schools and organizations need to be systematic and intentional about using video as a development tool.
Yeah. Doug, our time's nearly up and you've been incredibly generous. I've just got one or two questions. Tabiso and Karabo both asked about your inspiration to become a teacher, but I think you've covered that. Lauren wanted to know, this is a great question. Lauren wanted to know if you ever struggle to get people to listen to you and invest in you and take your ideas seriously as a young graduate. And this idea of how do you position yourself as a young person and how were you able to overcome that challenge?
Such a great question. One of the most useful phrases that I think I've heard and I think about a lot is from my colleague Paul Bambrick, who says that buy-in is an outcome, not a prerequisite. That of course people are skeptical, both when you show up and you're young and people may not, or you show up and you say, I want to do professional development for you, and people have been in schools where professional development is bad and they cross their arms and they're looking at their watches and they're like, my goal is to get through this thing. Mm. Of course they do that. In many cases, their experience is taught them to do that. And I think that it's incumbent on me to make the guidance that I give them so useful and so practical and make a difference quickly that it changes that if the things that we talk about, if they can turn around and use them on Monday, then they will believe in the professional development process or conversations about things. And so I think that buy-in is an outcome, not a prerequisite. I should expect people to be skeptical and have to just make sure that the quality of what I deliver in the end helps people. If it doesn't, that also means I have to make sure that I'm talking about the things that are relevant to them, not relevant to necessarily to me. Those might be slightly different things. And when that happens, I just think this is a really important thing in schools, right? Which is, if I want people to believe in professional development, they have to see the difference right away in their lives, in their classroom, in the productivity of their work, and their happiness. And so I just think that's I've always thought that that's on me to make sure that I deliver value to people. And in the end, that I think I won't convince everybody. There will be people who don't buy it, who make decisions for superficial reasons or on the merits, and they just don't think what I've shared with them will be good enough. But in the end, I think if you do that, you will convince the great majority of people, at least the great majority of people who do it for the right reasons. And then I think at some point, you have to decide who's worth spending your time talking to. And if people just aren't interested at all, I think this is a constant challenge in some schools, which is people are so resistant to feedback and professional development that, there are rooms where you can't win, where people are so skeptical. And in that case, I've worked with schools where I would say, let's start with a coalition of the willing, and let's start with the 10 teachers who really do want to change, and not think right now about the 30 teachers who have no interest and are skeptical and say, I don't want to be part of that. And let's make it so valuable and so compelling and so useful to those 10 teachers that A, they love it, and B, they start to shine, and C, they start to talk about it to their peers. And then their peers start to say, how come I haven't been invited to that? Or how come I can't do that? And that ultimately, if you start with the people who are receptive, they will become your advocates and and they will talk about the work, and they'll convince other people to come into the room.
Mm. The coalition of the willing. I love that. Thank you. The theme that we're going to be exploring this weekend is around being connected, with a particular focus on innovation and on leadership. You have spoken brilliantly to both of those aspects today. So thank you for orientating our thoughts. I want to finish off with what I think it's the thing that I love most about the way that you speak about the techniques. You've mentioned it already. In your introduction, you talk about teaching as an art, and that there are foundational skills, and then it's the teacher's job to unlock the secrets of their use. That there's no formula for teaching, that everyone's different, that they adapt, and that's the beautiful thing. And I love those words. I mean, you wrote that right at the very beginning. Has that changed, or has that just become reinforced? It feels like that as you've spoken today.
I think that's maybe why. Yeah, I think that's why I love teaching so much, is because it's that formula is sufficient for a lifetime's work. You know, you think about, like, it's a bit like being a craftsman. And if you're a craftsman and you're a furniture maker, do you ever get bored? Do you ever, like, no, because there are a thousand challenges. You can always be thinking about refining your techniques and taking on new challenges. And so I love I think an artisan's work, which is maybe how I describe the combination between, like, an artist, but an artist who has to create something practical for people, I think is incredibly, when you conceive of it that way, it's constantly fascinating. And that's one of the things that people deserve, which is to love your work and find your work fascinating and always challenging throughout your career. I think one of the challenges why we lose good people in teaching is because we no longer invest. Once you're good at teaching, often organizations stop investing in you and stop, professional development is for the new teachers or the struggling teachers. But in fact, the most important people to invest in are the artisans, the craftspeople who love every decision and every detail of, do you smile when you say that? If you say, how big is your smile when you cold call a student, and those are the people deserve to continue to grow and develop and have organizations invest in them on their path from good to great. And I think that's an area of opportunity, because it's one of the things that makes the teaching profession so compelling when it's done well. And when it's not done well, it's one of the things that maybe pushes people out of the teaching profession. Maybe the one thing that I think has changed, it's interesting that the theme of your event is Connect. I've just finished a new book, and its title is Reconnect. And it's about what to do post-pandemic. And I wrote it with several colleagues. But I think the idea is that the pandemic involved an immense amount of social isolation from students. And so they're both coming back with sort of historic learning gaps, but also, like, historically high levels of disconnection, isolation, anxiety, depression. And in fact, that's not just the result of the pandemic. It's the result of an epidemic that the pandemic happened during. And the epidemic is social media and smartphones, which have become universal among young people. And in fact, the data is really clear that this epidemic of isolation and disconnection among young people began before the pandemic, that it's a result of a life with less and less human contact and more online contact, which is less fulfilling and more isolating. And so I think that the craftsmanship of building a learning classroom is a combination of both academic things, but also social things, which is, how do we make it so that students are learning and they feel connected? We're deeply social beings, humans. One of the most fascinating pieces of research that I read for this book is about the cooperative eye hypothesis. I'm sorry, I know we're short on time. I'll try and make this quick, but humans are the only primate on the earth that have white sclera, that's the area around your pupils. Every other primate has dark sclera, and this makes our pupils especially visible to us. And so evolutionary biologists have wondered, why is this the case? And what they believe is that we have white sclera because we are so much more deeply social than any other primate. And then, in fact, we think of evolution as an individual phenomena, that we succeeded in evolution because each of us has a big brain and opposable thumb, and we stood upright on the savannah, and therefore we thrived against other species and other groups of humans. But in fact, if you stood upright on the savannah with your big brain and your opposable thumb for most of prehistory, you would have been something's lunch. That a human being by him or herself is very low on the on the food chain, but a group of human beings together who can coordinate and collaborate and work together and reliably under duress is all of a sudden an apex predator. And that it was in fact the moment when we realized that we could work together that caused us to succeed evolutionarily. And that is written in our bodies because it's so important to, someone rolls their eyes at you, or they shoot you a stern glance, or a flirtatious glance. Like, so much of our knowledge about our membership and inclusion in the group is communicated through our eyes, far more than any other species. And I think that because we now live in this very individualist culture, we sometimes overlook how important group belonging, group formation, group connection is. And I think as we come back to classrooms after a period of profound isolation, it's important to, to put ourselves in the sweet spot of there's a Venn diagram of academic rigor and social connection and belonging that students really need. I think those things work synergistically. But I think that's a second area that we have to think really deeply about engineering into the lives of our students, because it's a particular need now. And I just think that groupishness and the thirst for belonging is so relevant. And it's why the classroom, online learning, in some ways, years of online learning have, I think, made many of us think about the possibilities of online learning, but I also think just as much about the limitations of them, and that in the room together as a group, I think will always be the optimal place for learning and for connection. And we're lucky that that's what we get to do, to build those rooms that make students both learn and feel that belonging.
Okay, that's the dramatic pause. Thanks. You can stop recording. It's not going to get any better than that. Sure, Doug. Thank you. We've gone on and taken a lot more of your time than I asked for. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I apologize for just for the trickiness of scheduling this week. I just sometimes it goes that way. But I'm really thank you for giving me the opportunity to be a part of the great work that you guys do. So.
Yeah, no, great pleasure. I hope that you get away this weekend with family. I hope that's a good time, and blessings, as you enjoy that.
Thank you, you as well, and please keep in touch.
We'll do so. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks.
Cheers.